Mueller's going to drop the report. The Southern District is on you. There's these other investigations by the Democrats.
Well, you know, they say there are lots of things, but I don't know about these things, okay, just so you understand. Everyone says this one, that one. I don't even know about this. I said to my lawyers, are we being looked at here? They don't even know what people are talking about. There's so much fake news out there. It's a disgrace. If you look over the past 2 years, how many breaking news stories was there about me that turned out to be non-existent? So many of them.
Not that many. And it seems hard to believe that President Trump and his allies wouldn't be laser focused on the more than half a dozen federal and state investigations that have spun off Robert Mueller's investigation, including a probe of illegal campaign finance violations in the Southern District of New York, which has been called a greater existential threat to Trump's presidency than even the Mueller probe, as well as investigations into a pro-Trump super PAC, Trump's private businesses, the Trump family's taxes, the Trump Foundation, emoluments violations, the inaugural committee, and allegations of insurance fraud. We don't know what we don't know about the scope of the legal danger for Trump, his family, and his closest allies. But we do know that Rick Gates, who's been called a tour guide through the president's inaugural committee and all of its suspicious ties to Russians, is still very actively cooperating in one or more federal investigations. And we do know that 18.5 pages of material related to the illegal campaign contributions scheme still needed to be redacted from documents in Cohen's case to protect ongoing investigations. So it remains very likely that President Trump and his children are nowhere near out of the woods, legally speaking, no matter what Mueller's investigation may yield. Frank and the table are all back. This seems like, what was it, the season of wishful thinking, you know, it's all make-believe as people get trotted off to their sentencing hearings.
Well, unfortunately, Donald Trump is a master manipulator of perceptions. Yeah. He gaslights this country repeatedly. He's pathologically dishonest. And so he takes issues and will represent them the way he sees fit. And unfortunately, there are too many people who just take what he says as whole truth and as gospel. So that's why I think he hedges his bets in terms of what he says about things, because particularly in the Mueller report, he doesn't know how it's going to come out. But there's still a lot to come that I think he is going to continue to tack, depending on what the facts lay out.
You know, someone said to me at the end of the year, they were sort of trying to cajole the president out of the government shutdown, and they said it was. And this person is still an ally, and he said he lies so much he doesn't even know when he's lying. When you see that, is he lying or is he delusional?
I think C, both of the above. From the standpoint of he knows things that he says are wrong, but he intentionally does it. I think his mantra is, you know, never acknowledge any type of mistake. Always go on the offensive. Don't be on the defensive, and undercut your opponents any way you can. I mean, that was what he did. That was his modus operandi while he was in business. He would lie, cheat, and steal, unfortunately. And he has brought those attributes and tactics to the Oval Office.
A former intelligence official who analyzes human behavior described the last 6 days of behavior from the president as reeking of fear. You know, there is this sense that with not just Mueller ending, but with SDNY entering its new phase, with Gates, we now know still very much cooperating in whatever is ongoing, that there is this sense that even he can't believe what he said there to Maria Bartiromo.
If you've ever known anyone who is the subject of a federal criminal investigation, one federal criminal investigation, let alone multiple ones, as the president is, it is an extremely nerve-wracking thing. It is a lot of pressure for people to bear. And you see the president cracking all the time. This wasn't the first time. These last few days aren't the first time. You see him when he wakes up on Saturday mornings and has these Twitter sprees where it's kind of clear he's melting down. I don't know which part of it he believes and which part is delusion. Remember that George Costanza line in Seinfeld? Remember, Jerry? No, remember, Jerry, it's not a lie if you believe it's true. Yeah. I think he actually believes some of it's true. He is somewhat delusional. But it does drive home that whatever Mueller comes up with, the president's known criminal exposure, not necessarily his known political exposure, but his known criminal exposure has always been higher in the Southern District of New York case, because that's the only case where the Justice Department has said in court the president directed the commission of a crime. Yeah. I don't know whether that means he gets indicted. I think it's unlikely it happens while he's in office, but the statute of limitations on that crime runs until after the end of his first term. He's going to face some kind of jeopardy at that at some point, you have to believe.
And Chuck, 3 former prosecutors from SDNY have said the president can certainly be indicted, even if you're on the other side of that question. People have run the numbers on SOL, which means statute of limitations. If you've never worked at the Justice Department, you're not a lawyer. That was a new term to me, like the pronunciation of Veselnitskaya. I'm learning all these new things. But talk about the president. Take away this veil, this protection he has as president. I asked Jim Comey, and you were there. If he wasn't the president, would he be imminently charged in this case, this hush money case? I mean, talk about him as though he were like all of us.
If he were like all of us, to Matt's point, he would have a lot to worry about immediately, not when he was a former president, but immediately. The Southern District of New York, the federal prosecutors in Manhattan, made it clear that individual one, all right, directed an illegal campaign finance payments and a scheme. Right? That's a problem. It's a problem because it's a crime. What's so interesting to me is we know exactly what Mueller was asked to do because it's in a public order, and it's fairly well cabined. Right? It's Russian interference in the 2016 election and coordination with the Trump campaign. To use a March Madness basketball analogy, the court on which the Southern District of New York is playing is longer and wider, right? And we don't know everything that's there. You had a list. I'm sure you're right. I also could imagine there's other stuff, but they have much more freedom, much more room to roam than Mueller did. And that, if I were President Trump or one of his kids or somebody who worked in the Trump organization or writing checks so they could be sort of cashed by Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, I'd be worried right now.
Frank, I need to hear your thoughts on all of this, but also weigh in on what former prosecutors from SDNY have said about this not being rock solid, that perhaps the Southern District will press the Justice Department to take another look at this idea, this policy. It's not a law, it's a policy that you can't indict a sitting president.
Yeah, let's tackle some of this business first with regard to, you mentioned fear and his actions reflecting fear, and his former intel official who studies behavior. Here's the problem that many of us are having. This is not a normal human being, and by that I mean I've been involved in cases in my career where behavioral profilers came in and said, this behavior describes this kind of person, this is the guy you're looking for. And then when we catch the guy, and both the cases I'm thinking about happen to be serial bombers, it turns out when you sit this guy down, you get bizarre notions of that don't attach to reality, and that none of the rules apply to behavioral assessment. And here's why I'm saying this. When we see the president act out and we think, oh, this is the act of a guilty man, or this is these are the acts of a fearful man, only if that person is normal. And I'm telling you, I can't figure out whether he's acting this way because he's guilty and fearful of what's going to come out, or it's simply because he's an angry man who, as John Brennan said, has a life philosophy of attacking and denying no matter whether he's telling the truth or not. With regard to re-examining law, policy, this is a case of first impression as to whether a state or whether the Southern District of New York or the state attorney general or the Manhattan DA can actually indict a sitting president. But I think we're headed toward certainly appellate court level, if not Supreme Court level, decision making on whether this can happen, particularly if it comes from a state level.
Norm busting on every front. No one's going anywhere.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.